To swipe up now and go get that new By Curious, my new single that's just dropped on all streaming platforms. The link is in the bio. Make sure y'all tap in with me. Go check that out. It's streaming on all.
It was supposed to be a day filled with joy. On July 17, 2023, Bernicia Elizabeth Marie Lightfoot, known to many as the bold and rising rapper Alata, was celebrating her 26th birthday. Her social media pages, once full of music snippets, infectious laughter, and makeup transformations, were unusually quiet that day. For a woman known for commanding the spotlight and turning heads with her energy, that silence felt off. But no one knew that it would be the first sign something was terribly wrong. Friends and family tried calling, texting, anything to get a birthday response. But Bernicia, always quick with replies, didn't pick up. Concern turned into dread when loved ones realized that not a single person had seen her in over 24 hours. And as the minutes dragged into hours, and hours turned into an entire day, the worry began to bloom into a full-blown nightmare. She had been living in Bedford, a quiet suburb outside Cleveland, Ohio. It was where she was trying to rebuild, refocus, and rise, not just in her music career but as a woman. She'd survived struggles. She'd faced adversity. But she always bounced back with the kind of strength that earned her deep respect in her circle. That strength, however, couldn't protect her from the darkness that found her that week. When officers arrived at her apartment to do a welfare check, they found a home that was disturbingly quiet. Too quiet. There were signs that something had happened inside, something violent. But there was no Bernicia, no clear answers. Just questions that screamed louder with every passing moment. Word spread quickly. Social media was flooded with her pictures, her rap clips, pleas for help. "Where is Bernicia Lightfoot?" her friends posted over and over again. For days, those closest to her lived in limbo, clinging to hope, praying for good news, waiting for a call that would never come. Her absence was more than just physical. It left a deep ache that rippled through Cleveland's tight-knit Black creative community. Then came the news no one wanted. On July 21st, just days after she vanished, her body was found in a grassy, overgrown area of Cleveland's Slavic village. It was a part of the city scarred by poverty and abandonment, a place many passed by but few looked into. That's where they found her, lifeless and discarded. She didn't deserve that. No one does. The confirmation hit like a punch to the chest. A mother's worst nightmare, a friend's deepest fear, a community's most painful loss. She had been killed, taken violently and far too soon. All the dreams she carried, the verses she hadn't recorded, the stages she would never step on again, all silenced in a brutal act of betrayal and rage. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the person closest to her, someone she trusted, was the prime suspect. The same man she had once posted photos with. Someone who should have protected her, not ended her life. The betrayal was chilling. And it made her story even harder to bear. But Bernicia's story doesn't just end with tragedy. It's also a story of voice, talent, and resilience. It's a story of a woman who was building herself up through creativity and community, who used her platform not just for music but for empowerment. Her loss wasn't just a personal one. It was a cultural one, a blow to a generation of young women who saw themselves in her. This is the story of how Bernicia Lightfoot's light was stolen. But it's also the story of how her voice continues to echo, through her music, through the people she loved, and through the fight for justice that still goes on today. This is a story you'll never forget. Before she was a headline, Bernicia Elizabeth Marie Lightfoot was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and an artist. Born on July 19, 1997, in Cleveland, Ohio, she grew up in a city that's both rough and rich in soul. Like many young Black women in Cleveland, Bernicia had dreams bigger than her zip code. But unlike most, she had the talent, charisma, and drive to chase them. Under the name Alata, she carved out space in the local music scene, an unapologetic voice that fused hard truths with heavy beats. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was her escape, her weapon, her way to speak to the world. Her lyrics were raw and honest, laced with references to struggle, healing, and power. She had been working hard to get noticed. And slowly she was. Her online presence began to grow, and so did the admiration from her peers. She was fiery, confident, and magnetic, the kind of woman who lit up a room before she even spoke. But behind the spotlight, Bernicia was also trying to heal. Like many women navigating their 20s, she was juggling ambition, relationships, trauma, and hope. She was trying to move forward from a past that hadn't always been kind to her. Those close to her knew that she had been dealing with someone, a man who was volatile. There were red flags, but like many abuse victims, she carried the burden of trying to manage it silently. Leading up to her birthday in July 2023, Bernicia had been making moves. Her music was gaining traction and she was planning things. Projects, collaborations, maybe even a fresh start. On July 17th, just 2 days before her official birthday, she was supposed to be celebrating. But instead of posts and selfies and celebration, there was nothing. Silence. And for Bernicia, silence was not normal. When her family didn't hear from her on her birthday, something that had never happened before, they immediately knew something was wrong. At first, they thought maybe her phone was off or she was out with friends. But when hours passed with no response, their concern turned into full-blown panic. They began reaching out to anyone who might have seen her. Friends, neighbors, even fans online. The last known contact came from her apartment in Bedford. Neighbors recalled hearing a disturbance. Some said there were arguments leading up to that day. Others mentioned seeing a man, one they didn't recognize, going in and out of the building. When police were finally called to check on her, they found the front door locked, but inside, there were signs that something terrible had happened. Blood evidence, broken items. The signs of a struggle were unmistakable. But Bernicia was gone. No body, no goodbye. Just a haunting absence that filled the space she used to occupy. Her clothes were still there. Her keys. Her things. Everything was where it should be, except her. The community rallied fast. Flyers were printed. Posts were shared. Hashtags were created. People who loved her, or had simply loved her music, wanted answers. But days went by and nothing changed. Her name started showing up in Facebook groups and Reddit threads dedicated to missing Black women, spaces that sadly exist because these cases are often ignored. To those watching from the outside, it was another tragic missing person case. But to her family it was hell. The kind where you can't sleep, can't breathe, can't eat, because every second feels like time slipping away from saving someone you love. Her mother, her siblings, her friends, they were all stuck in a loop of panic, hope, and dread. And deep down, many of them already knew the truth they didn't want to face. That Bernicia wasn't coming back. What made it all more heartbreaking was that this happened during what should have been the happiest week of her year. Birthday. New age. A fresh chapter. But instead of candles and celebration, there was silence, worry, and ultimately, a devastating discovery. When police finally entered Bernicia Lightfoot's apartment in Bedford on July 18, 2023, what they found chilled them to the core. The space, once filled with music, laughter, and energy, was eerily still. But that stillness masked something much darker. Officers conducting a welfare check on behalf of concerned relatives quickly saw signs that something violent had happened inside those walls. There were traces of blood inside the apartment. Some reports said the blood was found smeared or spattered in certain areas, telling a story of struggle, a desperate one. Furniture appeared disturbed, as though someone had fought back. Items were broken or knocked over. It wasn't the scene of someone who had simply walked out or run away. This was something else entirely. And Bernicia was nowhere in sight. To investigators, it immediately became clear. Someone had been hurt badly here. And based on how long she had been missing, they feared it might be Bernicia. The evidence pointed to an attack, one likely fueled by rage. The kind of attack that doesn't happen randomly. The kind that usually comes from someone close. Detectives began combing the apartment for clues. Forensic teams moved in, carefully collecting samples. Blood, fingerprints, fibers, anything that might explain what had happened. They bagged her personal belongings and tried to reconstruct the timeline. When was the last time anyone had seen or heard from her? Who had access to the apartment? Who had motive? Almost immediately, suspicion fell on someone who had been close to her. A man she had dated. His name, Michael Rorty Nugent. He was no stranger to law enforcement. His record included past charges involving drugs, weapons, and allegations of violence. Neighbors said they had heard loud arguments coming from the apartment days before she went missing. Shouting, banging, the sound of things being thrown. He wasn't just a passing acquaintance. He had been involved in her life. And according to people close to Bernicia, their relationship had become increasingly toxic. There were signs of control, manipulation, even fear. But as is too often the case, those warning signs didn't surface publicly until it was too late. When police brought Rorty Nugent in for questioning, his story didn't add up. There were inconsistencies, vague timelines, and a general sense that he wasn't telling the whole truth. What's more, some of his personal items were found in Bernicia's apartment, even though he claimed he hadn't seen her. Investigators also noted fresh scratches and injuries on his body that he couldn't explain. By July 21st, just 3 days after the welfare check, Michael Rorty Nugent was arrested and formally charged with murder. Authorities believed he had not only killed Bernicia but had tried to cover it up. He was held on a $2 million bond. For her family, the arrest brought a measure of relief, but also a storm of grief. They had hoped for a miracle. Instead, they were preparing for a funeral. Yet even with Rorty Nugent in custody, there were still heartbreaking unknowns. Chief among them, where was Bernicia's body? Detectives pushed for answers, searching through surveillance footage, analyzing cell phone pings, and trying to retrace the suspect's steps in the days following her disappearance. The pieces were starting to come together. They just needed one more. And then, on July 21st, they found it. In Cleveland's Slavic Village, in a vacant grassy lot near East 64th and Francis Avenue, investigators discovered a woman's body. Dumped, discarded, and left out in the open, like she was nothing. The medical examiner later confirmed what her family had already feared in their hearts. It was Bernicia. The girl who once lit up stages and smiled into her camera lens was now the center of a crime scene. Her life had been stolen, but now there was no more denying it. By the time Bernicia Lightfoot's body was found in that overgrown lot in Cleveland's Slavic Village, all eyes were already turning toward one man, Michael Rorty Nugent. He wasn't just a stranger passing through her life. He had been her boyfriend, someone she had once loved and trusted. But beneath that surface was a storm that had been brewing quietly, dangerously. People close to Bernicia had long worried about their relationship. It wasn't just the usual ups and downs. There was something darker, more controlling. Friends said she sometimes went silent for stretches of time. Others said she looked anxious around him. But like so many women caught in emotionally or physically abusive relationships, she didn't always speak openly about it. Sometimes silence is its own survival strategy. Michael, 39 years old at the time, was known to law enforcement. His past included arrests for drug offenses, weapons charges, and alleged domestic violence. He had a pattern. And when someone like that is in a relationship with someone vulnerable, it becomes a ticking time bomb. Those closest to Bernicia feared he was becoming possessive, maybe even dangerous. Sadly, they were right. When police questioned him following her disappearance, his answers were murky. He claimed he hadn't seen her in days, but couldn't explain why his belongings were still in her apartment. He didn't seem too concerned about her well-being either, a red flag given how close they supposedly were. And then there were the injuries, scratches and bruises on his body that he brushed off, but couldn't properly explain. Investigators were also looking at digital breadcrumbs, phone records, text messages, GPS data. And what they uncovered painted a picture of tension, threats, and a final confrontation. Reports suggest the couple may have had a heated argument in the hours leading up to her disappearance. At some point it escalated and ended in violence. It didn't take long for police to make their move. On July 21, 2023, just hours after her body was discovered, Michael Rorty Nugent was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves through the community. The man who had once appeared beside her in selfies, smiling, was now in handcuffs, accused of taking her life. He was booked into jail and held on a $2 million bond. Prosecutors wasted no time laying out the case. They believed the murder wasn't an accident. It wasn't heat of the moment. It was violent, calculated, and after the act he tried to hide it. He had moved her body. He had tried to erase the scene. And in doing so, he showed a chilling disregard for the woman he once claimed to love. As the court proceedings began, Bernice's family filled the courtroom. Her mother, her siblings, friends from the music scene. They sat there quietly, heartbroken, listening to the details of her final moments. And for many, the hardest part wasn't just what happened. It was who did it. Someone from within her circle. Someone she likely trusted until the very end. Outside the courtroom, people lit candles and left flowers near the lot where her body was found. Others shared her music online, saying her voice deserved to live on. But no matter how many tributes were posted, the core pain remained. She should still be here, performing, laughing, living. The man now facing decades behind bars had taken so much more than just a life. He had taken potential, daughter, a dream, and a light that was just beginning to shine its brightest. In that courtroom, surrounded by silence and grief, justice had begun its slow journey, but healing would take much longer. The search for Bernice Lightfoot ended not with a joyful reunion, but with a grim discovery that broke her community's heart. On the morning of July 21, 2023, just a few days after she vanished without a trace, investigators were led to a vacant lot in Cleveland's Slavic Village, an area marked by years of disinvestment, boarded-up homes, and empty spaces that had been forgotten by the city. But this lot held something no one would ever forget. It was a warm day, but the mood was cold and heavy. Police tape went up quickly as investigators surrounded the scene near East 64th Street and Francis Avenue. Nestled between overgrown grass and discarded debris, they found the remains of a young woman. And even before the medical examiner confirmed the identity, everyone involved already knew. It was her. The body was left out in the open, without dignity or care, as if she were nothing. A life so full of energy, color, and creativity had been dumped like trash. It was a discovery that left officers shaken and neighbors stunned. People from the surrounding area stood at a distance, hands over their mouths, watching quietly as the scene unfolded. Even in a city where tragedy wasn't new, this hit differently. Once the remains were recovered, the confirmation came quickly. It was Bernice Elizabeth Marie Lightfoot, the same woman whose face had been plastered all over social media in the past few days. The same woman whose family had begged the public for information. She was gone. Not missing. Not hiding. Her body had shown clear signs of blunt force trauma, according to early reports. It wasn't just that her life had ended. It was how it ended that disturbed even the most seasoned investigators. This wasn't just a death. It was a violent, terrifying ordeal. And worst of all, she had died alone in fear, with no one there to help her in her final moments. Back in Bedford, word spread like wildfire. Family members who had been holding out hope collapsed into grief. Her mother, whose voice had been full of worry during media interviews, now had to prepare to bury her child. Friends from the rap scene lit candles and posted tribute videos, playing her music in the background as they tried to come to terms with the loss. At the same time, police worked to piece together exactly how her body ended up in that vacant lot. Surveillance footage, witness tips, and location data began to tell a clearer story. It appeared that Rorty Nugent, the man already in custody for her murder, had transported her body after the killing. He had dumped her in a neglected neighborhood, far from where she lived, as though no one would care enough to find her. But people did care. Strangers came by to leave flowers and messages at the site where her body was found. One note read, "You were loved. You were light. Someone else spray-painted her name on the fence nearby, turning the once forgotten lot into a sacred space. Slavic Village, for all its pain, had become the final chapter in a story that deserved so much more. And through it all, one truth kept echoing in the community's heart. She didn't deserve this. Not this end. Not this betrayal. Not this erasure. Bernicia had been trying to create a life of purpose, passion, and pride. And someone had tried to take that all away, not just from her, but from everyone who loved her. The discovery of her body may have brought answers, but it also brought unimaginable grief. Still, it allowed her family and her city to begin the process of mourning out loud, to grieve, to honor, and to fight for justice. And in that field where her body was found, something powerful remained. Her spirit. No longer just a statistic. No longer just a missing person. She had a name. She had a story. And the world would now hear it. With the discovery of Bernicia Lightfoot's body and mounting evidence pointing directly to her boyfriend, Michael Rorty Nugent, the wheels of justice began to turn swiftly. On July 21, 2023, the same day her remains were found, Rorty Nugent was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. For Bernicia's family, it was a moment of grim validation, confirmation that the man they feared had hurt her had, in fact, stolen her life. Prosecutors wasted no time. In the days that followed, additional charges were filed, including involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Each charge reflected not just the brutality of what had happened, but the cold-hearted decisions made after her death. The man who once smiled in photos beside her had not only taken her life but had tried to dispose of her like she was disposable. And now, the law was preparing to hold him accountable. Rorty Nugent appeared in court in late July, dressed in a jail-issued jumpsuit. He stood before the judge, silent and sullen. The courtroom was packed, not with supporters of the accused, but with grieving family members, friends, activists, and members of the Cleveland community who had followed Bernicia's story closely. The pain in that room was heavy. Her mother sat with trembling hands. Her loved ones cried silently as the charges were read aloud. He entered a not guilty plea, sparking a legal battle that would stretch over the next several months. But prosecutors were confident. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood found in the apartment, injuries on the defendant, witness accounts of disturbances, digital records tying him to the location where her body was dumped. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was direct. It was damning. Still, the defense attempted to build doubt. They argued that the death may not have been intentional, that there had been no premeditation, that perhaps it had been a domestic altercation that escalated out of control. But those close to Bernicia knew better. They had seen the signs, the fear, the tension, and the slow disappearance of her joyful spark in the weeks before her death. Over the course of the trial, her name was spoken hundreds of times. Photos were shown before and after. Witnesses took the stand. One friend tearfully recalled how Bernicia had once confided in her, saying she feared her boyfriend might hurt her. Another described the last time they heard from her, a text message that simply read, "I'm okay," sent with no punctuation, no emoji, just silence between the lines. Then came the verdict. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the judge handed down a decision. Michael Rorty Nugent was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The courtroom was silent for a moment, so quiet you could hear the breath catch in her mother's throat. And then came the tears, not of joy but of release. Justice, though delayed, had finally spoken. In November 2023, he was sentenced to 23 to 28.5 years in prison at Lorraine Correctional Institution. For some, it wasn't enough. How do you put a number on a life taken so violently? But for others, it was a measure of accountability, a rare moment where the system didn't look away from the death of a young black woman. Still, justice didn't erase the pain. It didn't bring back her laughter, her verses, or her presence. It didn't fix the ache her mother would carry every day, or the gap in the friend group where Bernicia used to stand. But it did something powerful. It told the truth. It called what happened to her by its name. It gave her story weight. And in a world where too many women like her are forgotten, that mattered. In the end, the court proceedings didn't just hold a man accountable. They served as a warning, a statement, and a reckoning. Domestic violence doesn't always leave visible scars until it's too late. And when justice finally arrives, it is often accompanied by a grief that never truly leaves. But at least now, Bernicia Lightfoot's name was spoken with dignity, her truth was heard, and her killer was behind bars. As the trial drew closer to its conclusion, a tense silence hovered over the courtroom each day. The weight of what had happened to Bernicia Lightfoot was ever present, not just in the prosecution's evidence, but in the eyes of her loved ones seated quietly in the gallery. They had endured the details, every photo, every witness, every timeline piece, waiting for one word: guilty. The prosecution argued relentlessly that Bernicia's death was not accidental. It was not a tragic misunderstanding or a split-second mistake. It was brutal, senseless violence, fueled by control, possessiveness, and rage. They showed the blood patterns in her apartment, the digital trails left behind, and his failure to call for help after the attack. This was not the behavior of someone shocked by a sudden tragedy. This was the method of someone trying to cover his tracks. Michael Rorty Nugent sat motionless for much of the trial, rarely showing emotion. But those watching saw something else: coldness, an absence of remorse. And for Bernicia's family, every day in that courtroom was like watching her die again, this time in slow motion. The defense attempted to cast doubt on motive and intent, but it was too little, too late. The evidence was too loud. Finally, the verdict came. After days of testimony and evidence review, the judge returned a ruling. Michael Rorty Nugent was found guilty on 3 counts: involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The charge of first-degree murder did not stick, but the weight of the convictions was still significant. In that moment, a stillness fell over the courtroom, then a quiet gasp, a sigh, a single tear rolling down a mother's face. Sentencing followed shortly after. The judge addressed the courtroom with firm words. This was not just a death, it was a desecration. A young woman's life was taken, and her body was discarded like trash. And that cannot go unanswered. She then delivered the sentence: 23 to 28.5 years in prison, to be served at Lorraine Correctional Institution. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was a clear statement that what happened mattered. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited for reactions. Bernicia's family didn't speak much. There was no celebration in justice, only quiet grief. Her mother clutched a small framed photo of her daughter, the same one Bernicia had used as a profile picture on social media. "My baby didn't deserve this," she said softly to a reporter. She was full of life, full of dreams. She just wanted to be loved. Her loved ones carried out the sentence with heavy hearts. No amount of time would bring her back. But there was comfort in knowing her killer would not walk free, that her name had not been forgotten or pushed aside like so many cases of black women who vanish or die under suspicious circumstances. In the weeks following the sentencing, community groups in Cleveland began speaking out about domestic violence, especially in relationships where the abuse is hidden behind closed doors. Bernicia's story became a rallying point, an urgent reminder that emotional, psychological, and physical abuse are all forms of danger. That silence, fear, and shame often keep victims from leaving until it's too late. Friends began sharing her music again, posting clips of her rapping on Instagram, smiling as she spit bars with undeniable talent. They used the hashtag Justice for Bernicia, not just to remember her, but to amplify the stories of other women like her. Those still in dangerous situations, those who made it out and those who never did. The courtroom chapter had closed. Her killer had been sentenced. But her story and its impact was only beginning. In the aftermath of the verdict, Bernicia became more than a victim. She became a voice. And while that voice had been silenced in the most brutal way, her community was determined that it would echo for years to come. In the days and weeks after Michael Rorty Nugent was sentenced, the shock of Bernicia's loss continued to ripple through Cleveland. Her absence was more than a void in her family. It was felt in the streets she walked, the studios she recorded in, and the lives she touched. For a while, it felt like the city itself was mourning. Billboards showed her photo, tributes played on local radio stations, and her face became a symbol of something much bigger than one crime. Her family did their best to move forward, but it was not easy. Bernice's mother said every morning still started the same way, with her reaching for her phone, hoping to see a text or call from her daughter. Never came. The house was quieter now. Holidays would never feel right again. Birthdays became memorials instead of celebrations. But through the pain, her mother remained determined to speak her name, loudly and often. Cleveland's creative community also stepped up. Fellow artists, especially young women in the local rap scene, began dedicating songs and shows to Bernice's memory. At open mic nights, people wore Justice for Bernice t-shirts and told stories of how she had inspired them. One performer shared that Bernice was the first woman who told her it was okay to take up space and be unapologetically loud with her art. Perhaps the most vocal tribute came from Sunsir Shakur, a close friend and activist who had worked alongside Bernice in community outreach before her death. Sunsir described her not just as talented, but as a warrior in a woman's body. He said she fought hard to heal from past trauma, to find her peace, and to use her voice for good. Losing her, he said, wasn't just personal, it was political. It spoke to a system that often fails to protect women until it's too late. As news of her case spread beyond Cleveland, her story began appearing in national discussions about intimate partner violence, especially in communities of color. Advocates used her case to push for better protective laws, stronger support systems for victims, and more visibility for missing Black women. For too long, those stories had been ignored. Bernice's was forcing people to pay attention. Her family, though shattered, leaned into that purpose. They created a small foundation in her name, focused on raising awareness around domestic violence and supporting at-risk young women in the city. "If we can stop even one girl from going through what she did," her sister said during a community forum, "then she didn't die for nothing." In Slavic Village, where her body had been found, a group of neighbors created a small garden in her memory. They cleaned up the lot, planted wildflowers, and placed a wooden bench where people could sit and reflect. On the back of the bench, burned into the wood, were the words, "She was light. She was love. She was here." That quiet act of remembrance sparked something. People began talking more openly about the warning signs of abuse, about how love shouldn't hurt, about how control, jealousy, and isolation are not signs of passion, they're signs of danger. Conversations that had once been whispered now had a place to breathe. Each time her name was spoken, at a rally, a vigil, or over a beat in someone's studio, it was a reminder that she mattered, that her life meant something, that she was more than a victim. She was a voice, a vision, and a vessel of truth. And no sentence, no headline, no courtroom could contain all of what she had left behind. In death, Bernice became a symbol, but in life she had already been a force. And that's how her community chose to remember her, not by the way she died, but by the way she lived, bold, brilliant, and unafraid to shine. The tragic death of Bernice Lightfoot is more than just a single crime. It's a reflection of patterns that stretch far beyond one relationship or one city. Her story forces us to look at the ways in which intimate partner violence hides in plain sight. So many women suffer silently, caught between love and fear, unsure of how to escape, or whether anyone would believe them if they tried. In Bernice's case, the warning signs were there. Uneasy silences, a controlling partner, sudden disappearances from social media, and subtle shifts in mood. But like many victims, she may have felt trapped. Culturally, emotionally, and financially. Domestic violence doesn't always begin with bruises. It starts with isolation, manipulation, and control. And for Black women in particular, the fear of not being taken seriously by police or courts can make speaking out feel even riskier. The data is sobering. According to the CDC, nearly half of Black women in the U.S. experience some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And yet, stories like Bernice's often go underreported or underinvestigated. Media coverage tends to fade faster when the victims are black, brown, or come from under-resourced communities. Her case gained traction because her community refused to stay quiet. But what about the women who don't have that support? Her story also underscores the danger of normalizing toxic relationships. Society sometimes romanticizes jealousy, possessiveness, or emotional dependency as signs of passion. But there's nothing romantic about fear. There's nothing loving about control. And when we fail to teach young people what healthy love looks like, we leave them vulnerable to manipulation disguised as affection. For women like Bernicia, independent, ambitious, and outspoken, the danger can sometimes be greater. Abusive partners often feel threatened by a woman's strength. What starts as admiration can twist into a desire to dominate or diminish. We need to start talking about how power imbalances, misogyny, and emotional insecurity all contribute to cycles of violence that can end in tragedy. This case also invites us to rethink how communities respond to red flags. It's not enough to say, "She should have left." The question is, what systems were in place to support her if she tried? Did she have access to safe housing, legal protection, mental health services, a trusted space to share what was happening? Too often the answer is no. Education plays a major role in prevention. From schools to churches to social media, conversations about boundaries, consent, and emotional abuse must become normalized. Just as we teach fire drills and stranger danger, we need to teach young people, especially young women, how to recognize when love becomes unsafe. And we need to teach everyone else how to listen when someone says they're in trouble. For men, this story is also a call to action. The burden of change should not rest solely on women protecting themselves. Men must confront toxic ideas about masculinity, entitlement, and dominance. They must challenge peers who make violence seem acceptable, and support those who are doing the work to heal and be better. Ultimately, Brenicia's story reminds us of the deep, often invisible costs of silence. But it also reminds us of the power of voice, how one woman's life, cut tragically short, can still echo through music, memory, and movement. She did not die in vain. Her name is now a symbol. And her story is a warning, a lesson, and a light. Because justice isn't just what happens in a courtroom. It's what we do afterward. It's how we protect the next woman. How we educate the next generation. How we shift culture so that love no longer coexists with violence. And no one has to fear dying at the hands of someone who once swore they loved them. Bernicia Lightfoot was more than a victim. She was a vibrant artist, a sister, a daughter, and a friend who poured her truth into everything she touched. Her laughter lit up rooms. Her music echoed with strength. And even in her silence, she had a voice that couldn't be ignored. Though her life was stolen in the cruelest way, her story has become a source of light, a reason for others to speak out, to stand up, and to pay closer attention to the signs that often go unseen. What happened to her should never happen to anyone. And while the justice system played its part, real justice means preventing tragedies like this from happening again. It means listening to the quiet cries, believing survivors, and building communities where love does not come with bruises or fear. We all have a role to play, in our homes, our neighborhoods, and our culture. Because safety shouldn't be a privilege, should be a right. To those watching this video, if you or someone you know is in an unsafe relationship, please know you are not alone. Help is out there. Your life matters. Your voice matters. And you deserve peace, protection, and freedom. Speak up, reach out, and don't wait. Sometimes one conversation can save a life. Let Brenicia's story stay with you, not as just another headline, but as a reminder that behind every victim is a life that mattered. Name, soul, future stolen. If this story moved you, share it. Keep the conversation going. Help break the silence for the next woman who's afraid to speak. If you believe stories like Brenicia's deserve to be told, and that no victim should be forgotten, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more true stories that matter. At Pearl True Crime Stories, we shine a light on the lives behind the headlines, because every story deserves to be heard, and every voice deserves justice.